Welcome to Story Tales. Please like this video and subscribe to Story Tales. I hope you enjoy the story. Let's begin. The alarm clock screamed at 4 a.m., same as it had for the past 26 years. Grant Holloway's calloused hand slapped it silent before the second beep could wake Lorna. She stirred anyway, her silk nightgown rustling against the expensive sheets she'd insisted they needed. Grant, her voice carried that familiar edge of annoyance. Just getting ready for work. He kept his voice low, pulling on yesterday's jeans in the dark. Could you be quieter? Some of us don't have to leave at ungodly hours. Grant said nothing. He'd learned years ago that defending his 4 a.m. start time necessary for reaching the power lines before peak heat only led to arguments about his choices. As if he'd chosen anything about this life except to work harder than any man should have to in the kitchen. He made coffee in the old pot Lorna kept threatening to replace with one of those fancy machines. The bitter brew went into a thermos scarred from years of job sites. Cold leftover meatloaf became his lunch, wrapped in aluminum foil and stuffed into a cooler that had seen better decades. Through the window, he could see his reflection 48 years old, gray threading through dark hair, lines carved deep around his eyes from squinting into sun and wind. A high-voltage lineman's face. Not handsome like the men Lorna watched on her television shows, but honest. The garage held his truck, a reliable Ford with 200,000 miles and counting. No payments, no fancy features, just 4 wheels and an engine that started every morning. Lorna's SUV sat beside it, gleaming white with leather seats and a payment book that made Grant's jaw clench. "Morning, Dad." Grant looked up to see his father, Tate, shuffling into the garage. At 74, the old Marine still rose before dawn, though his heart kept him from doing much more than that. "Morning, Pop. You should be sleeping. Can't sleep when I hear you banging around out here." Tate settled onto an overturned bucket, his breathing labored. "Besides, wanted to talk to you." Grant checked his tool belt, counting the items by touch. "About what?" "About the way they treat you in this house." "Pop, no, hear me out." Tate's voice carried the authority of a man who'd led Marines through hell. "I've watched you break your back for that girl's education. $8,000 a year, plus all the extras. You eat cold food and wear worn-out clothes while they live like queens." Grant's hands stilled on his tools. "Reese is graduating medical school next month. It was worth it, was it? When's the last time either of them thanked you? When's the last time they asked how your day went or if your back was hurting?" The questions hung in the morning air. Grant couldn't answer them because he couldn't remember. Loyalty without respect is a dead man's leash, son. Don't forget that. Grant climbed into his truck without responding, but Tate's words followed him onto the road. The drive to the job site took 40 minutes through Idaho farmland. Other men would listen to music or talk radio. Grant preferred silence. It let him think, and lately his thoughts kept circling back to the same questions his father had asked. When had Lorna stopped kissing him goodbye? When had Reese stopped calling just to talk? When had he become invisible in his own home? The power lines stretched across the valley like giant strings, carrying electricity to homes and businesses that never thought about the men who risked their lives to keep the lights on. Grant parked beside the other trucks and joined his crew. "Morning, Grant." Eddie Martinez, his supervisor, looked tired. "Got a bad transformer on the north line. Probably be up there most of the day." Grant nodded and started checking his safety equipment. Harness, hard hat, insulated gloves, voltage tester. Each piece of gear could mean the difference between going home alive and going home in a box. The climb up the 60-foot pole was routine by now, his body moving with practiced efficiency. At the top, with the wind whipping around him and the ground far below, Grant felt something he never felt at home: respect. Out here, his skills mattered. His knowledge kept people safe. His experience made the difference between success and disaster. But at home, he was just Grant, the man who paid the bills and fixed the broken things and disappeared into the background of their lives. His phone buzzed. A text from Lorna. "Need money for Reese's graduation dress. $400. $400. Grant looked down at his worn work boots, the soles he glued back on twice rather than buy new ones. $400 for a dress Reese would wear once while he made his lunch in foil and drove a truck old enough to vote. He typed back, "Okay." The workday stretched long and hot. A transformer replacement that should have taken 4 hours turned into 8 when they discovered the original installation had been done wrong. Grant worked through lunch, his cold meatloaf forgotten in the cooler, focusing on the complex wiring that could kill him if he made one mistake. By the time he got home, the sun was setting and his back felt like someone had driven railroad spikes into his spine. The house glowed with warm light, and through the windows, he could see Lorna and Reese at the kitchen table, laughing over something on Reese's laptop. They didn't look up when he walked in. "How was your day?" Grant asked, setting his lunch cooler on the counter. "Busy," Lorna said without lifting her eyes from the screen. "I had 3 parent conferences and a district meeting." Reese found her dress for graduation. "That's good." Grant opened the refrigerator, looking for something to eat. "What's for dinner?" "We already ate. There's leftover Chinese in the fridge." Cold Chinese food from a container. Grant pulled it out and ate standing at the counter while his wife and daughter planned the graduation party he was paying for, but apparently not important enough to include in the conversation. "Dad, you're dripping sauce on the floor," Reese said, still not looking at him. Grant cleaned up the drops and went to his bedroom. Lorna came in an hour later, already in her nightgown, smelling of the expensive lotion she bought online. "Reese wants to have her graduation party at that new rooftop restaurant in Salt Lake," she said, settling into bed with her tablet. "The one with the view." "How much?" "Does it matter? This is our daughter's medical school graduation. We only get to do this once." Grant stared at the ceiling. Their daughter. As if Lorna had worked 60-hour weeks in dangerous conditions to pay for it. As if Lorna had given up every luxury, every comfort, every small pleasure to make sure the tuition checks never bounced. "I'll take care of it," he said. Lorna was already absorbed in her tablet, scrolling through social media posts of other people's perfect lives. Grant closed his eyes and tried to sleep, but Tate's words echoed in his mind. "Loyalty without respect is a dead man's leash." In the darkness, he began to wonder what would happen if he ever took off that leash. The rooftop restaurant overlooked Salt Lake City like something from a movie. Glass walls, modern furniture, and prices that made Grant's blue-collar heart skip beats. He'd driven 3 hours in his work truck, showered and changed in a gas station bathroom, and put on his only good suit, the one he'd bought for his wedding 22 years ago. Reese's graduation party was already in full swing when he arrived. Young professionals in expensive clothes clustered around high-top tables, drinking cocktails that cost more than Grant made in a day. He recognized none of them. "Grant." Lorna appeared at his elbow, resplendent in a black dress that probably cost more than his truck payment. "You made it." I was beginning to worry. Traffic was heavy. Grant looked around the room, searching for his daughter. "Where's Reese?" "Over there, talking to Dr. Pemberton from the hospital. She's already making connections." Lorna's voice carried pride and something else, a subtle emphasis on already, that made Grant feel like he was already behind. Grant spotted Reese across the room, stunning in a $400 dress, animated as she spoke to a silver-haired man in an expensive suit. She looked confident, successful, ready to take on the world. For a moment, Grant felt his chest swell with pride. All those years of sacrifice, all those early mornings and late nights, all those checks written from accounts that barely had enough to cover them, it had been worth it to see her like this. He pulled the scrapbook from under his arm. 26 years of memories bound in leather. Reese's first steps, her first day of school, report cards and award ceremonies, birthday parties and Christmas mornings. Grant had saved every receipt from her medical school payments, every note she'd written him as a child, every photo that showed the journey from his little girl to the doctor she'd become. "Reese." He approached her group, the scrapbook held carefully in both hands. "Congratulations, sweetheart." She turned, and for just a moment, Grant saw something flicker across her face. Not pleasure or gratitude, but something closer to embarrassment. "Dad." Her voice was flat. "You came." "Of course I came. This is your day." Grant held out the scrapbook. "I made this for you. It's everything from when you were born right up to today. All the sacrifices and all the memories." The group around them had gone quiet. Dr. Pemberton and the others watched with polite attention, waiting to see what would happen next. Reese looked at the scrapbook like it was something diseased. "Dad, your job is done. You really don't belong here." The words hit Grant like a physical blow. Around them, conversations died. The rooftop restaurant seemed to hold its breath. "What? Your job was to pay for my education, and now it's finished. I'm a doctor now. I need to be around people who understand my world." Reese's voice was calm, matter of fact, as if she were explaining something simple to someone slow. "This is my future. You're my past." Grant felt the scrapbook tremble in his hands. 26 years of love and sacrifice, reduced to a job that was now done. Lorna appeared beside them, her laughter bright and sharp. "Oh, Grant, you don't know your place, do you? This isn't really your crowd." The group around them shifted uncomfortably. Dr. Pemberton cleared his throat and found somewhere else to be. The other young professionals suddenly discovered urgent conversations across the room, but no one defended him. No one said, "That's her father. Show some respect." No one acknowledged the man who had made this moment possible. Grant stood there in his 22-year-old suit, holding a scrapbook full of love that nobody wanted, surrounded by people who saw him as nothing more than an obstacle to their sophisticated evening. "I see," he said quietly. He tucked the scrapbook back under his arm and walked toward the exit. Behind him, he heard Lorna laugh again, heard her say something about knowing how to handle him, heard the conversations resume as if nothing had happened. In the elevator down, Grant caught his reflection in the polished steel doors. The same lined face, the same calloused hands, the same honest features that had never been quite good enough for the life Lorna wanted or the daughter he'd raised. The 3-hour drive home passed in silence. Grant didn't turn on the radio. He didn't stop for coffee. He drove through the darkness with his daughter's words echoing in his mind. "Your job is done. You don't belong here." By the time he reached Boise, something had crystallized in Grant's chest, hard and cold as winter steel. He'd spent 26 years being loyal to people who felt no loyalty to him. He'd respected people who showed him none in return. Tate was waiting in the kitchen when Grant walked in at 2 a.m. "How'd it go, son?" Grant set the scrapbook on the table, unopened and unwanted. "My job is done, Pop." They made that very clear. Tate looked at the scrapbook, then at his son's face, and nodded slowly. "Then I guess it's time to decide what your next job's going to be." Grant walked to his bedroom, where Lorna was sleeping peacefully in their bed, dreaming her dreams of social status and respectability. He stood in the doorway for a long moment, watching the woman who had laughed at his humiliation, who had never once defended him when their daughter had cut him down to 26 years of marriage. 26 years of putting their needs before his own. 26 years of working himself to the bone for people who saw him as nothing more than a source of funding. Your job is done. Maybe it was. Lorna and Reese returned from Salt Lake City 3 days later, still glowing from the graduation party and the networking opportunities it had provided. They came through the front door, talking and laughing, their voices bright with the satisfaction of a job well done. Dr. Pemberton said he might have an opening in his practice, Reese was saying as she dropped her expensive purse on the hall table. And that attorney, Michael something, he was definitely interested in taking me to dinner. "I told you this party would be worth every penny," Lorna replied, kicking off her heels. "Connections are everything in your field." They walked into the kitchen, still chatting about the wonderful people they'd met and the promising future that lay ahead. It took them several minutes to notice that something was wrong. The silence was the first clue. Grant's coffee pot wasn't burbling on the counter. His work boots weren't by the door. The familiar sounds of his presence, the morning routine that had anchored their days for over 2 decades, were absent. "Grant," Lorna called out, "are you here?" No answer. Reese shrugged and opened the refrigerator, looking for the expensive yogurt she liked. "Maybe he's at work." At 9 p.m., Lorna frowned and walked toward the bedroom. "Grant, we're home." The bedroom was empty. The bed was made with military precision, the way Grant had learned from his father. But his dresser drawers were open and empty. His side of the closet gaped like a missing tooth. "Reese," Lorna's voice carried a note of panic. "Come here." They stood together in the bedroom doorway, staring at the evidence. Grant's clothes were gone. His work boots, his tools, his few personal possessions all vanished. "Maybe he's just doing laundry," Reese said, but her voice lacked conviction. They searched the house methodically. The basement revealed empty spaces where Grant's workshop tools had been. The garage showed an oil stain where his truck had sat, but no truck. Even his father's room was empty, stripped of the few belongings Tate had accumulated in his months of living with them. In the study. Lorna went straight to the computer where they kept their financial records. Her fingers flew across the keyboard, calling up bank statements and account balances. No. The word came out as a whisper. No. The checking account showed a balance of $247. The savings account, the one they'd built up over years of Grant's overtime and sacrifice, was empty. The money market account that held their emergency fund was closed. What's wrong? Reese demanded, reading panic in her mother's face. He's taken everything. Every account, every dollar. Lorna's voice rose with each word. How could he do this? How could he leave us with nothing? They found a note on the kitchen table, tucked under the scrapbook Grant had tried to give Reese at the graduation party. The handwriting was Grant's careful script, the words measured and final. You made it clear I don't belong, so I'll vanish. But I'll take my sacrifices with me. Below the note was a stack of papers, bank statements, insurance policies, account transfers. Everything legally documented, everything properly executed. Grant had been methodical, thorough, and completely within his rights. This can't be legal, Lorna said, her voice shaking. He can't just take everything. But as she read through the papers, the truth became clear. The accounts had been in Grant's name. The money had come from Grant's paychecks. The sacrifices had been his to make and his to reclaim. Reese picked up the scrapbook with trembling hands and opened it to the first page. Her baby picture smiled back at her, along with a receipt for her first pair of shoes and a note in Grant's handwriting. Reese's first steps, March 15th. She walked right to me like she knew I'd catch her. Page after page of memories. Report cards with Grant's proud notes in the margins. Photos of birthday parties and Christmas mornings. Receipts for school clothes, medical bills, tutoring sessions. A steady record of love and sacrifice that spanned 26 years. And tucked into the back cover, a stack of medical school payment receipts. $8,000 a year for 4 years, plus fees and living expenses. Over $40,000 in total, documented and dated, representing hundreds of hours of dangerous work on power lines and thousands of small sacrifices that had added up to her future. Oh God, Reese whispered, sinking into a chair. What have we done? Lorna grabbed her phone and dialed Grant's number. It went straight to a recording. This number has been disconnected. She tried again, her fingers shaking. Same recording. He's really gone, she said, the words barely audible. He's actually gone. For the first time in years, Lorna and Reese truly saw their home through Grant's eyes. The expensive furniture he'd worked overtime to afford. The luxury items they'd taken for granted. The comfortable life built on his labor and sacrifice. A life they'd enjoyed while treating him like an unwelcome intruder. We have to find him, Lorna said, pacing the kitchen. We have to explain. We have to make him understand. Understand what? Reese's voice was hollow. That we treated him like garbage? That we told him he didn't belong in his own life. The truth hung between them like a physical presence. For 26 years, Grant had been the foundation of their family, supporting their dreams and ambitions with his steady work and quiet sacrifice. And they had responded by treating him as an embarrassment, a burden, a job that was finally done. Now he was gone, taking with him not just the money but the security and stability they'd never appreciated until it was missing. Lorna sank into a chair beside her daughter, both of them staring at the scrapbook that told the story of a love they'd rejected and a sacrifice they'd scorned. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the windows of the house that Grant had maintained and protected for over 2 decades. But inside, there was only silence and the growing realization that they had driven away the one person who had truly loved them. The man whose job was done had taken his tools and his heart and disappeared into the night, leaving behind only the echoes of their own cruel words and the question that would haunt them both. What had they done? 2 weeks after Grant's disappearance, the fairy tale began to crumble. Reese sat in her apartment, the sleek downtown loft that had been her graduation gift too, herself staring at an eviction notice. The elegant space with its exposed brick walls and city views had been her pride, the symbol of her success and independence. Now it felt like a prison. "This can't be right," she said in her phone, speaking to the property management company for the third time that day. "There must be some mistake." "No mistake, Miss Holloway. The lease is in Grant Holloway's name, and he's terminated at effective end of this month. Since you're not listed as a co-signer, we need you to vacate." Reese's hand shook as she hung up. The apartment wasn't in her name. She'd never signed a lease, never dealt with deposits or credit checks. Grant had handled everything, just like he always did, working behind the scenes to make her life easier. The parking garage held another shock. Her BMW, the sleek silver sedan that had been her reward for getting into medical school, sat under a yellow boot. A notice on the windshield explained that the insurance had been canceled for non-payment. More calls revealed the pattern. Her cell phone would be disconnected in 3 days. Her credit cards, all of which she thought were her own, were actually tied to accounts that Grant had closed. Even her gym membership and Netflix subscription were about to disappear. Meanwhile, across town, Lorna was discovering her own version of hell. She sat in her principal's office at Riverside Elementary, facing Superintendent Patricia Wells, a woman she considered a friend and ally in the complex world of school district politics. "I'm sorry, Lorna, but we need to discuss your relationship with Nolan Farrow." The words hit Lorna like ice water. Nolan Farrow, 50 years old, married, and a member of the school board. Nolan, who had promised her a different life, who had whispered about leaving his wife, who had made her feel young and desired again. "I'm not sure what you mean," Lorna said carefully. Patricia slid a manila folder across the desk. Inside were printed emails, text messages, and photos, evidence of an affair that Lorna thought had been carefully hidden. Someone sent these to the school board anonymously. "They show a pattern of inappropriate communication between you and Mr. Farrow, including arrangements to meet during school hours and discussion of district business that should have remained confidential." Lorna's face burned as she recognized her own words, her own flirtations, her own indiscretions laid out in black and white. Worse were the photos her and Nolan at restaurants, in his car, outside the hotel where they'd met on Thursday afternoons when Grant was working late. "This is a violation of your professional ethics code," Patricia continued. "And given that Mr. Farrow is married and serves on the board that oversees your employment, it creates a serious conflict of interest." "Patricia, please. This isn't what it looks like. It looks like an administrator having an affair with a board member and using school resources to facilitate that relationship." Patricia's voice was cold, professional. "I'm placing you on administrative leave pending a full investigation." Lorna stumbled out of the building in a daze. Her career, built over 15 years of careful networking and political maneuvering, was crumbling around her. Everything she'd worked for, everything she'd prided herself on, was being destroyed by evidence she couldn't deny. Her phone buzzed with a text from Nolan. "We need to talk." They met at a coffee shop across town, far from anyone who might recognize them. Nolan looked haggard, his usually perfect appearance disheveled and stressed. "My wife knows," he said without preamble. "Someone sent her copies of everything. Our emails, our photos, even hotel receipts." Lorna felt the world tilt around her. Who would do that? "I don't know, but whoever was had access to things that should have been private. My personal accounts, your school email, even security footage from the hotel." Nolan's hands shook as he lifted his coffee cup. "Margaret's filing for divorce. She's taking the kids, the house, everything. But you said you were going to leave her anyway. You said we could be together once. That was before this became public." Nolan's voice was sharp, desperate. "Don't you understand? My reputation is destroyed. The board is demanding my resignation. I can't be seen with you anymore, Lorna. I can't even be in the same room as you." The man who had promised her everything, who had made her feel beautiful and important, was cutting her loose to save himself. "So that's it? After everything we meant to each other?" Nolan stood up, not meeting her eyes. "What we meant to each other was a mistake. I have to think about my family now." He walked away, leaving Lorna alone with her coffee and the wreckage of her life. That evening, mother and daughter sat in their living room, each lost in their own crisis. The house felt enormous and empty without Grant's presence, without the steady routine of his work and care that had anchored their lives. "I can't afford my apartment," Reese said quietly, "and my car's been repossessed. Everything was in Dad's name." "I'm suspended from work," Lorna replied. They found out about Nolan. Someone sent them evidence of everything. They looked at each other across the expensive living room, the furniture Grant had worked overtime to buy, the decorations he'd never complained about even when they doubled their credit card debt. "You think Dad did this?" Reese asked. "Who else could it be? Who else would have known about Nolan? Who else would have had access to all our information?" The answer hung between them, unspoken but understood. Grant, the man they dismissed as simple and uncomplicated, had been quietly watching their lives, quietly documenting their betrayals, quietly preparing for this moment. "We underestimated him," Reese whispered. Lorna nodded, fear creeping into her voice. "The question is, what else does he know? What else is he planning?" Outside, the wind howled around the house that Grant had maintained and protected for over 20 years. But inside, his wife and daughter huddled together, beginning to understand that the man they'd driven away wasn't the simple, forgiving fool they believed him to be. He was something far more dangerous. A man with nothing left to lose and 26 years of quiet resentment to fuel his revenge 800 miles away. In the mountains of Montana, Grant Holloway was building a new life with methodical precision. The cabin belonged to Dylan Buckner, his father's old Army buddy, and it sat on 50 acres of pristine wilderness where the nearest neighbor was 10 miles away. Dylan had fought alongside Tate in Vietnam, and when Grant called asking for help, the old soldier hadn't hesitated. "Place has been empty since my divorce," Dylan had said over the phone. "You're welcome to it as long as you need." Now Grant sat on the cabin's porch, watching the sun set over the Rockies while Tate dozed in a chair beside him. The old Marine's heart condition had worsened since they'd left Boise, but the mountain air seemed to ease his breathing. "Feeling guilty yet?" Tate asked without opening his eyes. "About what?" "About leaving them high and dry. About taking back what was yours." Tate's voice carried the hint of a smile. "It's okay if you are. Shows you're still human." Grant sipped his coffee, real coffee, not the cheap instant he'd been drinking for years to save money. "I'm not guilty. I'm angry." "Good. Anger's useful if you channel it right." Inside the cabin, Grant had set up a makeshift office at the kitchen table. His laptop, bought with his own money for the first time in years, displayed multiple windows: bank accounts, email archives, social media profiles, public records searches. For 26 years, Grant had been invisible in his own home. But invisible didn't mean unobservant. He'd watched, listened, and remembered everything. Lorna's late-night phone calls when she thought he was asleep. Reese's casual lies about where she'd been and what she'd done. The slow erosion of respect that had turned him into a stranger in his own life. Now that knowledge was becoming weapons, Grant opened a folder on his desktop labeled Reese Medical School. Inside were documents he'd been collecting for months, evidence of his daughter's casual relationship with the truth. The medical school rotations were supposed to be sacrosanct hands-on experience that couldn't be faked or shortcut. But Reese had found ways around the requirements, forging attendance records while she traveled to conferences and networking events that looked better on her resume. Grant had the proof. Credit card receipts showing she'd been in Miami during a week she was supposed to be doing emergency medicine rotations in Salt Lake City. Hotel bills and flight records that contradicted the clinical hours she'd reported. Text messages to friends bragging about gaming the system and working smarter, not harder. Any medical licensing board would be very interested in this information. Grant opened another folder, Lorna Nolan Farrow. This one was thicker, more detailed. Hotel receipts charged to the school district credit card. Email chains discussing confidential personnel matters. Photos taken by a private investigator Grant had hired 3 months ago, when Lorna's lies had become too obvious to ignore. The investigator, a retired cop named Jim Bradley, had been thorough. He documented not just the affair, but the professional misconduct that went with it. Lorna had been using her position as principal to steer contracts toward companies that Nolan favored. She'd shared confidential student information with him. She'd violated every ethical standard of her profession. Grant's phone rang. Jim Bradley's name appeared on the caller ID. Grant, got some news for you. Nolan Farrow's wife filed for divorce this morning. Looks like she got our package. And Lorna, suspended from her job as of yesterday. The school board's calling for a full investigation. Jim's voice carried satisfaction. You sure you want to keep going with this? They're already pretty well destroyed. Grant looked out at the mountains, thinking about the graduation party, about his daughter's cold dismissal, about his wife's laughter at his humiliation. Keep going, he said. I'm not done yet. That evening, Grant drove into town to meet with Professor Elena Rodriguez at the community college where he'd taught electrical safety courses for the past 5 years. Elena was someone he trusted, someone who'd always treated him with respect. Grant, it's good to see you, Elena said as they settled into her office. Though I have to admit, I'm curious about your call. You said you had some information that might interest the state medical board. I do. Grant slid a manila envelope across her desk. My daughter just graduated from medical school. I've discovered that she may have falsified some of her clinical rotation hours. Elena opened the envelope and began reading. Her eyebrows rose as she took in the credit card receipts, the flight records, the documented evidence of academic fraud. This is serious, Grant. If these allegations are true, it could result in her losing her medical license before she even starts practicing. I know. Grant's voice was steady calm, but I believe the board needs to see this. Patient safety depends on doctors who've actually completed their training. Elena nodded slowly. I agree. Would you like me to forward this through proper channels? I'd appreciate that. And Elena? I prefer if this remained anonymous for now. Of course. The board will investigate thoroughly, regardless of the source. Grant left the college feeling lighter than he had in months. Justice wasn't revenge, but it was a start. Back at the cabin, he found Tate awake and lucid, sitting by the fire Dylan had built. How'd it go, son? The medical board will receive Reese's information tomorrow. Lorna's already suspended from her job. Grant settled into the chair beside his father. I should feel better about this. But you don't. I keep thinking about the girl who used to crawl into my lap and ask me to read her stories. The woman who used to kiss me goodbye every morning. Grant stared into the flames. When did they stop being those people? Tate reached over and gripped his son's shoulder with a hand that shook but still carried strength. They stopped being those people when they stopped seeing you as one. You can't love someone back to life, Grant. Sometimes you just have to let them face the consequences of who they chose to become. Outside, Montana wind whispered through the pines, carrying the scent of snow and the promise of winter. Inside the warm cabin, Grant Holloway sat planning the next phase of his quiet war, feeling something he hadn't experienced in years, the satisfaction of being respected, even if he had to earn that respect with fear. The envelope arrived at the Utah State Medical Licensing Board on a Tuesday morning, unmarked except for the return address of a concerned citizen. Inside, Administrative Director Dr. Sarah Chun found 40 pages of meticulously documented evidence that would change one young doctor's life forever. Credit card receipts showing purchases in Miami during required hospital rotations in Salt Lake City. Flight records contradicting clinical hour logs. Screenshots of social media posts geotagged in locations hundreds of miles from where Reese Holloway claimed to be completing her medical training. Most damaging were the text message screenshots between Reese and her friend Jessica Kim, bragging about working the system and finding ways to maximize networking opportunities while still meeting minimum requirements. Holy shit, one message read, I can't believe I'm getting full credit for the EM rotation while I'm sitting by a pool in South Beach. Thank God for flexible professors and creative scheduling. Dr. Chun had seen academic fraud before, but rarely documented so thoroughly. Someone had spent considerable time and effort collecting this evidence, and that someone clearly had intimate knowledge of Reese Holloway's activities. 3 days later, Reese received the certified letter at her mother's house. Her apartment was no longer available, and she'd been forced to move back home with whatever belongings she could salvage. Ms. Holloway, the letter began, the Utah State Medical Licensing Board has received allegations regarding potential violations of academic integrity during your medical school training. You are hereby summoned to appear before the board for a formal hearing. Reese's hand shook as she read the charges. falsification of clinical records, academic fraud, misrepresentation of training hours. Each allegation carried the potential for suspension or permanent revocation of her medical license. Mom, her voice cracked as she called for Lorna. Mom, you need to see this. Lorna emerged from the bedroom, where she'd been hiding since her suspension, still in her bathrobe at 3 in the afternoon. Her own legal troubles had left her hollow-eyed and defeated, but this new threat to her daughter sparked something desperate in her eyes. What is it? Reese handed her the letter with trembling fingers. As Lorna read, her face went through a series of transformations: confusion, disbelief, and finally, rage. Your father, she whispered. This has to be your father. But how could he know about the rotations? How could he have all this evidence? Lorna thought back to the past year, remembering Grant's quiet presence in their home, his habit of doing household tasks while they talked and planned. He'd always been there, invisible and ignored, but listening to everything. He was always fixing things, always organizing papers. I thought he was just being helpful. Lorna's voice grew cold, but he was gathering ammunition. The hearing was scheduled for 3 weeks later. Reese hired an attorney with money she didn't have, borrowing against credit cards that were already maxed out. James Whitman was expensive, but supposedly the best at defending medical professionals facing license challenges. I'm not going to lie to you, Whitman said during their first meeting. The evidence against you is compelling. These credit card receipts, the flight records, the social media posts, they paint a clear picture of someone who is not where she claimed to be during required training. But everyone cuts corners, Reese protested. Everyone finds ways to make the system work better. I still learned everything I needed to learn. That's not the point. Medical training requirements exist for patient safety. If you were in Miami instead of the emergency room, you weren't gaining the experience that the state requires for licensure. Whitman leaned back in his expensive chair. The question is, who had access to all this information? Someone with intimate knowledge of your activities, your credit cards, your travel plans. Someone who's been watching you very carefully. Reese knew the answer, but saying it out loud felt like admitting defeat. My father. Why would your father want to destroy your career? The question hung in the air like an accusation. Reese thought about the graduation party, about the cruel words she'd spoken, about the man who'd worked himself to exhaustion to pay for her education. Because I told him his job was done, she whispered. Because I told him he didn't belong. The hearing room of the medical board was sterile and intimidating, with fluorescent lights that cast harsh shadows and made everyone look sickly. Reese sat beside her attorney, wearing her most conservative suit and trying to project competence and remorse in equal measure. The board members, 5 distinguished physicians with decades of experience, reviewed the evidence with professional detachment. Dr. Rodriguez, the chief of internal medicine at University Hospital, asked the questions that cut deepest. Ms. Holloway, can you explain how you were able to complete a required emergency medicine rotation while your credit card records show purchases in Miami? There was some flexibility in the scheduling. I made up the hours later. Made up how? Emergency medicine requires real-time experience with actual patients in crisis situations. How does one make up that experience? Reese had no good answer. Her attorney tried to argue about procedural issues and the anonymous nature of the evidence, but the documentation was too thorough, too damning. The social media posts were particularly devastating. Screenshots showed her at beach resorts and networking conferences during weeks when her official transcripts indicated she was in hospital rotations. Worse, the tone of her messages to friends revealed a cavalier attitude toward the requirements that other students followed scrupulously. I can't believe I'm getting away with this, one post read. While everyone else is pulling all-nighters in the ICU, I'm building connections that will actually matter for my career. Work smarter, not harder. Dr. Chun, who had first reviewed the evidence, asked the final question. Ms. Holloway, do you understand that patients' lives depend on physicians who have received complete and honest training? Yes, of course. Then can you explain why you believed you were entitled to shortcut that training while your classmates completed it honestly? Reese broke down. 6 months ago, she had been Dr. Reese Holloway, ready to conquer the medical world with her intelligence and ambition. Now she was a fraud exposed, facing the destruction of everything she'd worked toward. "I thought I could do both," she sobbed. "I thought I could meet the requirements and build my career at the same time. I didn't think it would hurt anyone." The board deliberated for 2 hours. When they returned, Dr. Rodriguez delivered the verdict with clinical precision. The board finds that Ms. Holloway engaged in academic fraud by misrepresenting her clinical training hours. Her medical license is hereby suspended pending completion of additional supervised clinical rotations and a comprehensive ethics review. The suspension period will be no less than 18 months. Reese's career was over before it had begun. The woman who had told her father his job was done now had no job of her own, no prospects, and no way to repay the enormous debt she'd accumulated pursuing a profession she was no longer qualified to practice. Outside the hearing room, Whitman offered cold comfort. "You can appeal, but frankly, the evidence is overwhelming. Your best bet is to complete the additional rotations and hope the board eventually reinstates your license." Reese nodded numbly, thinking about the apartment she'd lost, the car that had been repossessed, and the mountain of debt that would follow her for years. Most of all, she thought about the man who had built this trap so carefully, so methodically, with the patience of someone who had been planning revenge for a very long time. Her father had been right about one thing. His job was done. But the job he'd finished wasn't funding her education. That IT was destroying her life. The phone call came at 3:47 a.m., piercing the silence of the house that had once been a home. Lorna fumbled for the receiver, hoping against hope that it might be Grant, that he might have forgiven them, that he might be ready to come back and make everything normal again. Instead, she heard the voice of Margaret Farrow, Nolan's soon-to-be ex-wife, and it was thick with alcohol and rage. "You destroyed my family," Margaret slurred into the phone. 23 years of marriage, gone because of you. "Margaret, don't you dare speak my name." The voice grew sharper, more focused. "I know who you are. I know what you did. And I'm going to make sure everyone else knows too." The line went dead, leaving Lorna staring at the phone in the darkness. Through the thin walls, she could hear Reese sobbing in her childhood bedroom, the same room she'd left years ago in triumph, now returned to in defeat. The next morning brought fresh humiliation. Lorna's suspension from the school district had become public knowledge, and the local newspaper ran a front-page story about the inappropriate relationship between a principal and a school board member. The article didn't name names, but in a town the size of Boise, anonymity was impossible. Worse, Margaret Farrow had made good on her threat. Screenshots of Lorna's text messages with Nolan appeared on social media, shared and reshared by parents, teachers, and community members who had once respected her. The messages were damning, not just evidence of the affair, but proof of the professional misconduct that had accompanied it. "Can you believe our kid's principal was sexting a board member?" read one Facebook comment that had been shared hundreds of times. "What else was she doing with our tax dollars?" Lorna couldn't leave the house without facing stares and whispers. At the grocery store, former colleagues crossed to the other side of the aisle rather than acknowledge her. Parents who had once sought her advice for their children now looked at her with disgust and disappointment. Meanwhile, Reese was learning that professional destruction had a cascade effect. The medical license suspension was just the beginning. The student loans that had funded her education loans co-signed by Grant were now in default because he'd stopped making payments. Her credit score had collapsed, making it impossible to rent an apartment or finance a car. Worse, the medical community was small and gossip traveled fast. Word of her license suspension had spread to the hospital where she'd hoped to complete her residency. The program director called personally to withdraw their offer. "I'm sorry, Ms. Holloway, but we can't place a resident whose credentials are under investigation. Even if your license is eventually reinstated, the shadow of academic fraud would follow you throughout your career." One by one, the doors that had been opened to Dr. Reese Holloway slammed shut. The networking contacts she'd cultivated, the mentors who had praised her potential, the career trajectory she'd mapped out, all of it evaporated like morning mist. She found herself applying for jobs that didn't require a medical license. Medical device sales, pharmaceutical research, administrative positions at healthcare companies. But even these opportunities were scarce for someone with her particular baggage. I'm overqualified, she told Lorna after another rejection. They think I'll leave as soon as I get my license back. And honestly, they're probably right. Mother and daughter sat in their living room, still furnished with the expensive pieces Grant had worked overtime to afford, trying to figure out how to survive. Lorna's salary was gone, her reputation destroyed. Reese had no income and massive debt. We could sell the house, Lorna suggested half-heartedly. With what equity? Dad refinanced it twice to pay for my medical school. We probably owe more than it's worth. The credit card bills arrived daily, statements showing charges for the lifestyle they could no longer afford. Reese's graduation dress, Lorna's expensive dinners with Nolan, spa treatments and shopping trips that had seemed so important when Grant was paying for them. How do we not see this coming? Reese asked, staring at a collection notice for her car loan. Because we never looked, Lorna replied, her voice hollow. We never looked at the bank statements. We never asked where the money came from. We just assumed it would always be there. They'd been living in a bubble of privilege and entitlement, cushioned by Grant's quiet sacrifice and steady work. Now the bubble had burst, and they were falling through air with nothing to catch them. The house felt enormous and empty without Grant's presence. His coffee pot sat unused on the counter. His chair at the kitchen table remained pushed in, as if he might return at any moment to reclaim his place. But Lorna knew he wouldn't return. The man who had loved her for 22 years, who had worked himself to exhaustion for their comfort, who had asked for nothing more than respect and appreciation, was gone forever. In his place was someone else, someone who planned methodically, who struck with precision, who showed no mercy to those who had shown him none. He's not finished with us, Lorna said, voicing the fear that kept her awake at night. This is just the beginning. Reese looked at her mother, seeing her own terror reflected in the older woman's eyes. What else can he do? He's already destroyed our careers, taken our money, ruined our reputations. I don't know, Lorna whispered, but I know Grant. When he commits to something, he sees it through to the end. And we've given him 26 years' worth of reasons to hate us. Outside their expensive house, in the town where they'd once commanded respect, Grant Holloway's wife and daughter waited for the next blow to fall. The man they dismissed as simple and weak was proving to be neither, and the job he'd started wouldn't be done until their destruction was complete. The Boise Veterans Hall hadn't seen a crowd this size in years. Word had spread through the blue-collar community that Grant Holloway was returning to speak at the monthly gathering of local tradesmen and veterans. The man who had disappeared without explanation 6 months ago, whose sudden absence had sparked rumors and speculation throughout the working-class neighborhoods of the city. Grant stood at the podium, looking out at faces he'd known for decades. Electricians and plumbers, welders and mechanics, men and women who understood the value of hard work and honest wages. Behind him sat Tate, his father's wheelchair positioned where he could see the crowd, and Dylan Buckner, the Montana friend who had become his strongest ally. Most of you know me, Grant began, his voice carrying easily through the packed hall. I've worked alongside many of you, shared coffee with you at job sites, helped you wire houses and fix broken equipment. For 26 years, I've been part of this community. Murmurs of agreement rippled through the crowd. These were people who remembered Grant's reliability, his skill, his willingness to help a neighbor in need. Tonight, I want to talk about something that affects all of us, the difference between real commitment and fake promises, between people who sacrifice for others and people who take that sacrifice for granted. In the back of the hall, Lorna and Reese slipped in through the side door. They'd heard about Grant's return through the local news coverage, and despite their lawyer's advice to avoid any contact with him, they couldn't stay away. They needed to see what he was planning, needed to understand the man who had systematically destroyed their lives that Grant's eyes found in the crowd. But his expression didn't change. He continued speaking as if they were strangers. I know men who've worked 2 jobs for 30 years to put their kids through college. Women who've cleaned offices at night after teaching school all day just to make ends meet. People who've sacrificed their health, their comfort, their dreams for the people they love. The crowd was with him now, nodding at stories they recognized from their own lives. And I know what happens when that sacrifice isn't respected. When the people you bled for tell you that your job is done, that you don't belong in their world anymore. Grant's voice hardened, and several people glanced toward the back of the hall, where Lorna and Reese stood frozen. Real commitment means showing up every day, even when it's hard, even when you're tired, even when nobody thanks you. It means putting other people's needs ahead of your own, year after year, without keeping score. He paused, letting his words sink in. But when that commitment isn't returned, when loyalty becomes a one-way street, when respect disappears and gratitude turns to contempt, then it's time to make a choice. You can keep giving to people who see you as nothing more than a source of funding, or you could take back your power and use it for something better. The applause started slowly, then built to a roar. These were people who had felt unappreciated, who had worked thankless jobs, who had given more than they received. Grant's words spoke to their deepest frustrations and fears. 6 months ago, I made that choice. I took back what was mine and left behind people who couldn't see my worth. Now I'm here to invest that sacrifice in something better. This community, these people, the next generation of workers who will build America's future. Grant gestured to a banner behind him. The Holloway Skills Foundation, teaching trades, building lives. We're starting with $1 million grant to expand the community college's electrical and welding programs. Full scholarships for local students who want to learn skills that matter, skills that can't be outsourced or automated. The crowd erupted in cheers. $1 million was more money than most of them would see in a lifetime, and Grant was giving it away to help their children. But this is just the beginning, Grant continued. I've learned that sometimes you have to be ruthless to protect what matters. Sometimes you have to cut out the infection to save the patient. Sometimes your job isn't to forgive and forget, it's to remember and make sure justice gets done. In the back of the hall, Lorna felt her knees go weak. The mild-mannered man she'd married, the quiet husband she'd taken for granted, was gone. In his place stood someone harder, someone who commanded respect through strength rather than begging for it through sacrifice. After the speech, people crowded around Grant, shaking his hand, thanking him for his generosity, welcoming him back to the community. Local news reporters interviewed him about the foundation, about his plans for the future, about his transformation from lineman to philanthropist. Lorna and Reese tried to approach him as the crowd thinned, but Dylan Buckner stepped between them and Grant, his military bearing unmistakable. I don't think Mr. Holloway wants to speak with you, Dylan said quietly. He's my husband, Lorna protested. Grant said, not turning around. Past tense. Reese stepped forward, her voice breaking. Dad, please. We need to talk. We need to explain. Explain what? Grant finally turned to face his daughter, his eyes cold as winter steel. Explain how you told me I didn't belong? Explain how you laughed when your mother cut me down? Explain how you both treated me like an embarrassment while spending the money I bled for. We made mistakes, Reese whispered. We were wrong. But we're family. Family doesn't humiliate each other in public. Family doesn't throw away 26 years of sacrifice like garbage. Grant's voice was conversational, matter of fact. You made your choice at that graduation party. Now live with it. He walked away, surrounded by people who respected him, leaving his wife and daughter standing alone in the emptying hall. The man they'd driven away had not only survived, he'd thrived. And he was using his success to build something lasting while they struggled to survive the wreckage of their own making. The law offices of Peterson, Martinez and Associates occupied the top floor of Boise's second tallest building, with views of the valley that stretched to the mountains beyond. Attorney Rebecca Martinez had handled the Holloway family's legal affairs for 15 years, but she'd never seen a case quite like this one. Grant sat across from her desk, calm and composed, while Lorna and Reese fidgeted in the chairs beside him. This was the first time they'd been in the same room since the Veterans Hall confrontation 3 weeks earlier, and the tension was thick enough to cut. Thank you all for coming, Rebecca said, settling behind her desk with a thick folder. As you know, we're here to discuss the estate of Eleanor Holloway, Grant's mother, who passed away 8 years ago. Lorna frowned. I thought we settled Eleanor's estate years ago. There wasn't much, just some personal items and a small life insurance policy. That's what we thought, Rebecca agreed. However, Some new information has come to light regarding a piece of property that Mrs. Holloway owned. Grant said nothing, but his expression suggested he knew exactly what was coming. Rebecca opened the folder and withdrew a deed, yellowed with age but still legally binding. Eleanor Holloway owned 27 acres near Flathead Lake in Montana. The property was purchased in 1963 and has been in her name ever since. That's impossible, Lorna said. Eleanor never owned property in Montana. She lived in that tiny apartment until she died. Actually, she did. The property was bought with insurance money from her first husband's death and held as an investment. Over the years, Mrs. Holloway paid the taxes through an automatic deduction from her bank account, but she never developed the land or visited it. Rebecca slid the deed across the desk. According to this document, Eleanor left the property to her true family, a phrase that seemed ambiguous at the time of her death. "We are her family," Lorna protested. Grant was her only child, and Reese was her only grandchild. That's correct. However, 3 years ago, Mrs. Holloway filed an amendment to her will. Rebecca produced another document. She specified that true family meant those who showed her respect and care during her final years. Grant finally spoke. Mom spent her last 5 years asking to visit. She wanted to see Reese's school plays, wanted to come to Christmas dinner, wanted to be part of our lives. But there was always an excuse. Too busy. Not enough room. She might embarrass us in front of our friends. The words hit Lorna like physical blows. She remembered those conversations, remembered suggesting that Eleanor might be more comfortable in her assisted living facility rather than joining their holiday celebrations. So she left the property to Grant alone, Rebecca continued. But that's not the most interesting part. The 27 acres have appreciated significantly over the past 60 years. Flathead Lake has become one of Montana's most desirable locations for vacation homes and development. She slid an appraisal across the desk. The number at the bottom made Lorna gasp. $2.3 million. Grant inherited property worth over $2 million, Rebecca said. Property that has been legally his for 3 years, though the title transfer was only completed last month. Reese stared at the documents in shock. $2 million? Dad, why didn't you tell us? Because it wasn't any of your business, Grant replied calmly. Just like my bank accounts weren't your business. Just like my decision to leave wasn't your business. But we could have. Lorna started. Could have what? Treated me with respect if you'd known I was worth something? Pretended to love me if there was money involved. Grant's voice was cold, clinical. That's exactly why Mom changed her will. She knew the difference between people who loved her and people who saw her as a burden. Rebecca cleared her throat. Actually, there's one more thing. Grant has already sold the property. What? Lorna's voice cracked. The sale closed last week. The new owners plan to develop a luxury resort. Rebecca handed Grant a check. After taxes and fees, the net proceeds were $1.8 million. Grant folded the check and put it in his pocket without looking at the amount. Half goes to the Eleanor Holloway Memorial Education Fund, which will provide scholarships for students in the trades. The other half funds the apprenticeship program I announced last week. You're giving it all away, Reese whispered. Every penny. To people who will appreciate it, who will use it to better themselves and their communities. Grant stood up, preparing to leave. To people who understand the value of hard work and honest commitment. Lorna found her voice. Grant, please. We're still legally married. In Idaho, I'm entitled to half of any assets acquired during our marriage. Grant smiled for the first time since entering the office. Actually, you're not. The property was inherited, not acquired. And even if it were marital property, you'd have to prove you were a faithful spouse to claim it. He nodded to Rebecca, who produced another folder this one thick with photographs, hotel receipts, and documented proof of Lorna's affair with Nolan Farrow. Idaho is a no-fault divorce state, but adultery still affects property division, Rebecca explained. Given the documented evidence of Mrs. Holloway's extramarital relationship, her claim to any assets would be challenging. Grant walked toward the door, then paused. Oh, and Lorna? I filed for divorce this morning. You'll be served with papers tomorrow. He left them sitting in the attorney's office, staring at the documents that represented the final destruction of their financial hopes. $2 million had been within their reach, money that could have solved all their problems, restored their status, given them a fresh start. Instead, it was gone, donated to causes that would help people who actually deserved help. Grant had taken their last hope and given it away, not out of spite, but out of principle. The man they'd underestimated had been sitting on a fortune for 3 years, living modestly and working hard while they spent money they didn't have on luxuries they didn't need. He'd known his worth all along in every sense of the word. The divorce proceedings moved with the mechanical efficiency of a well-oiled machine. Lorna had hired the best attorney she could afford, which, given her current financial situation, wasn't very good, but it hardly mattered. Grant had documentation for everything. The courtroom in the Ada County Courthouse was sterile and impersonal, fluorescent lights casting harsh shadows on the worn wooden benches. Lorna sat beside her lawyer, Thomas Brennan, a tired-looking man who specialized in quick divorces and payment plans. Grant's attorney, by contrast, was Rebecca Martinez, experienced, thorough, and armed with evidence that left no room for argument. "We made mistakes," Reese whispered. "We were wrong. But we're family. Family doesn't humiliate each other in public. Family doesn't throw away 26 years of sacrifice like garbage." Grant's voice was conversational, matter of fact. "You made your choice at that graduation party. Now live with it." He walked away, surrounded by people who respected him, leaving his wife and daughter standing alone in the emptying hall. The man they'd driven away had not only survived, he'd thrived. And he was using his success to build something lasting while they struggled to survive the wreckage of their own making. The law offices of Peterson, Martinez and Associates occupied the top floor of Boise's second tallest building, with views of the valley that stretched to the mountains beyond. Attorney Rebecca Martinez had handled the Holloway family's legal affairs for 15 years, but she'd never seen a case quite like this one. Grant sat across from her desk, calm and composed, while Lorna and Reese fidgeted in the chairs beside him. This was the first time they'd been in the same room since the Veterans Hall confrontation 3 weeks earlier, and the tension was thick enough to cut. "Thank you all for coming," Rebecca said, settling behind her desk with a thick folder. "As you know, we're here to discuss the estate of Eleanor Holloway, Grant's mother, who passed away 8 years ago." Lorna frowned. "I thought we settled Eleanor's estate years ago. There wasn't much, just some personal items and a small life insurance policy." "That's what we thought," Rebecca agreed. "However, some new information has come to light regarding a piece of property that Mrs. Holloway owned." Grant said nothing, but his expression suggested he knew exactly what was coming. Rebecca opened the folder and withdrew a deed, yellowed with age but still legally binding. Eleanor Holloway owned 27 acres near Flathead Lake in Montana. The property was purchased in 1963 and has been in her name ever since. "That's impossible," Lorna said. "Eleanor never owned property in Montana. She lived in that tiny apartment until she died." "Actually, she did. The property was bought with insurance money from her first husband's death and held as an investment. Over the years, Mrs. Holloway paid the taxes through an automatic deduction from her bank account, but she never developed the land or visited it." Rebecca slid the deed across the desk. "According to this document, Eleanor left the property to her true family, a phrase that seemed ambiguous at the time of her death." "We are her family," Lorna protested. "Grant was her only child, and Reese was her only grandchild." "That's correct. However, 3 years ago, Mrs. Holloway filed an amendment to her will." Rebecca produced another document. She specified that true family meant those who showed her respect and care during her final years. Grant finally spoke. "Mom spent her last 5 years asking to visit. She wanted to see Reese's school plays, wanted to come to Christmas dinner, wanted to be part of our lives. But there was always an excuse. Too busy, not enough room, she might embarrass us in front of our friends." The words hit Lorna like physical blows. She remembered those conversations, remembered suggesting that Eleanor might be more comfortable in her assisted living facility rather than joining their holiday celebrations. "So she left the property to Grant alone," Rebecca continued. "But that's not the most interesting part. The 27 acres have appreciated significantly over the past 60 years. Flathead Lake has become one of Montana's most desirable locations for vacation homes and development. She slid an appraisal across the desk. The number at the bottom made Lorna gasp. $2.3 million. Grant inherited property worth over $2 million, Rebecca said. Property that has been legally his for 3 years, though the title transfer was only completed last month. Reese stared at the documents in shock. $2 million? Dad, why didn't you tell us? Because it wasn't any of your business, Grant replied calmly. Just like my bank accounts weren't your business. Just like my decision to leave wasn't your business. But we could have. Lorna started. Could have what? Treated me with respect if you'd known I was worth something? Pretended to love me if there was money involved. Grant's voice was cold, clinical. That's exactly why Mom changed her will. She knew the difference between people who loved her and people who saw her as a burden. Rebecca cleared her throat. Actually, there's one more thing. Grant has already sold the property. What? Lorna's voice cracked. The sale closed last week. The new owners plan to develop a luxury resort. Rebecca handed Grant a check. After taxes and fees, the net proceeds were $1.8 million. Grant folded the check and put it in his pocket without looking at the amount. Half goes to the Eleanor Holloway Memorial Education Fund, which will provide scholarships for students in the trades. The other half funds the apprenticeship program I announced last week. You're giving it all away, Reese whispered. Every penny. To people who will appreciate it, who will use it to better themselves and their communities. Grant stood up, preparing to leave. To people who understand the value of hard work and honest commitment. Lorna found her voice. Grant, please. We're still legally married. In Idaho, I'm entitled to half of any assets acquired during our marriage. Grant smiled for the first time since entering the office. Actually, you're not. The property was inherited, not acquired. And even if it were marital property, you'd have to prove you were a faithful spouse to claim it. He nodded to Rebecca, who produced another folder this one thick with photographs, hotel receipts, and documented proof of Lorna's affair with Nolan Farrow. Idaho is a no-fault divorce state, but adultery still affects property division, Rebecca explained. Given the documented evidence of Mrs. Holloway's extramarital relationship, her claim to any assets would be challenging. Grant walked toward the door, then paused. Oh, and Lorna? I filed for divorce this morning. You'll be served with papers tomorrow. He left them sitting in the attorney's office, staring at the documents that represented the final destruction of their financial hopes. $2 million had been within their reach, money that could have solved all their problems, restored their status, given them a fresh start. Instead, it was gone, donated to causes that would help people who actually deserved help. Grant had taken their last hope and given it away. Not out of spite, but out of principle. The man they'd underestimated had been sitting on a fortune for 3 years, living modestly and working hard while they spent money they didn't have on luxuries they didn't need. He'd known his worth all along in every sense of the word. The divorce proceedings moved with the mechanical efficiency of a well-oiled machine. Lorna had hired the best attorney she could afford, which, given her current financial situation, wasn't very good, but it hardly mattered. Grant had documentation for everything. The courtroom in the Ada County Courthouse was sterile and impersonal, fluorescent lights casting harsh shadows on the worn wooden benches. Lorna sat beside her lawyer, Thomas Brennan, a tired-looking man who specialized in quick divorces and payment plans. Grant's attorney, by contrast, was Rebecca Martinez, experienced, thorough, and armed with evidence that left no room for argument. Your Honor, Rebecca addressed Judge Patricia Walsh, my client is seeking a dissolution of marriage based on irreconcilable differences. However, given the documented adultery committed by Mrs. Holloway, he is also requesting that all property division reflect the fault-based nature of the marriage's breakdown. Judge Walsh reviewed the file, her expression neutral but thorough. She'd seen thousands of divorces, but this case was unusual in its completeness. Every financial record, every property deed, every bank statement was accounted for and documented. Mrs. Holloway, the judge said, are you contesting any of the financial disclosures provided by your husband? Lorna's attorney whispered frantically in her ear, but she knew it was hopeless. No, Your Honor. And are you disputing the evidence of extramarital conduct? The photographs were there in the court, record Lorna and Nolan Farrow at restaurants, hotels, in his car. The documentation was overwhelming and undeniable. No, Your Honor. Judge Walsh nodded. Very well. Given the evidence presented, I'm granting the divorce as requested. Mrs. Holloway, you are entitled to seek spousal support, but given the circumstances of the marriage's dissolution, such support would be limited. Brennan stood up. Your Honor, my client is currently unemployed due to circumstances related to the divorce. She has been out of the workforce. She was suspended from her job for professional misconduct related to her extramarital affair. Rebecca interrupted. The same affair that led to the breakdown of this marriage. The request for spousal support is denied, Judge Walsh declared. Mrs. Holloway is a healthy, educated woman with professional experience. The court expects her to support herself. It was over in less than 30 minutes. 22 years of marriage, dissolved with the efficiency of a business transaction. Lorna walked out of the courthouse a single woman with no income, no prospects, and no one to blame but herself. That afternoon, Reese received her own devastating news. She'd been working as a receptionist at a family practice clinic, hoping to stay connected to the medical field while she waited for her license suspension to be reviewed. It was humiliating work for someone who'd trained to be a doctor, but it paid the bills and kept food on the table. Doctor Michelle Stevens, the clinic owner, called her into the office at the end of the day. Reese, I'm sorry, but I have to let you go. But why? I've been doing good work. The patients like me. It's not about your performance. It's about your reputation. Dr. Stevens looked uncomfortable but determined. Word has gotten around the medical community about your license suspension. Parents don't want someone with academic fraud allegations handling their children's appointments. But I'm just the receptionist. I'm not practicing medicine. It doesn't matter. Perception is reality in this business. Having you here reflects poorly on the clinic's reputation. Reese cleaned out her desk in silence. Her medical degree meaning nothing. Her years of training worthless. Her future as uncertain as her mother's. That evening, mother and daughter sat in their living room, surrounded by the expensive furniture they could no longer afford. The house felt like a museum of their former lives, beautiful, hollow, and utterly empty of the warmth that Grant's presence had provided. I got a job offer today, Lorna said quietly. That's great. Where? Walmart. Overnight stocking. Lorna's voice was flat, defeated. Minimum wage, no benefits. But it's the only place that would hire me. Reese stared at her mother, the woman who had once commanded respect as a school principal, who had socialized with the town's elite, who had looked down on Grant's blue-collar friends. Now she would wear a name tag and stock shelves while her former colleagues slept. We could leave town, Reese suggested. Start over somewhere else. With what money? We can't afford to move. We can barely afford to stay. They sat in silence, contemplating the ruins of their lives. Everything they'd built on Grant's sacrifice had crumbled when he withdrew his support. They'd been living in a house of cards, and he'd been the foundation holding it all together. The knock at the door interrupted their misery. Reese opened it to find a process server with an envelope. Ms. Reese Holloway. Yes. You're being sued for repayment of educational loans in the amount of $127,000, plus interest and penalties. Reese's hands shook as she signed for the papers. Grant had co-signed her student loans, and now that he'd stopped making payments, the lenders were coming after her directly. How can they do this? She asked Lorna. I don't have that kind of money. Because your father removed his financial support. The loans were always your responsibility. He was just helping you make the payments. Another knock, another envelope. This time, it was foreclosure proceedings on the house. Without Grant's income, they'd missed 3 mortgage payments, and the bank was moving to reclaim the property. As the sun set on their former life, Lorna and Reese faced the reality of their situation. They were about to lose everything: the house, their credit, their social standing, their future prospects. All because they'd failed to appreciate the man who had given them everything. Outside their window, they could see the billboard that Grant had erected on the main highway leading into town. The Holloway Skills Foundation, building tomorrow's workforce today. His name was 20 feet tall, visible to everyone who entered or left the city. The man they dismissed as unimportant had become the most prominent citizen in town. The husband and father they'd driven away was now respected, successful, and powerful. And every day, as they drove past that billboard on their way to minimum wage jobs and collection agency appointments, they would be reminded of what they'd lost and who they'd lost it to. Grant Holloway's job wasn't done after all. It was just beginning. 1 year later, the transformation was complete. Grant stood in the main workshop of the Holloway Skills Center, watching 25 young people learn welding techniques that would serve them for life. The facility occupied a renovated warehouse on the edge of town, equipped with the latest technology and staffed by instructors who understood that teaching a trade was about more than just technical skills. "Looking good, boss," Dylan Buckner said, joining Grant at the observation window. The old soldier had moved to Boise permanently, serving as the center's operations manager and Grant's closest advisor. "It's what Mom would have wanted," Grant replied, watching a 17-year-old girl master a complex welding joint. She always said the most important thing you could give someone was the ability to support themselves. Behind them, Tate dozed in his wheelchair, his heart medication keeping him comfortable but unable to do much more than observe. At 75, he was proud of what his son had accomplished, proud of the respect Grant commanded, proud of the way justice had been served. The local newspaper had featured Grant on its front page the previous month, highlighting his transformation from lineman to philanthropist. The article praised the Skills Center, the scholarship program, and the positive impact on the community. Grant Holloway had become a local celebrity, a success story that proved the value of hard work and determination. Across town, in a different world entirely, Lorna emerged from her night shift at Walmart, her blue vest wrinkled and her name tag crooked. Lorna H. It read the surname she'd kept out of habit rather than pride. At 47, she looked older than her years, worn down by work that demanded physical stamina she no longer possessed. The apartment she rented was in the cheapest part of town, a one-bedroom unit with thin walls and broken appliances. It was a far cry from the suburban home she'd shared with Grant, but it was what she could afford on a retail worker's salary. Her phone buzzed with a text from Nolan Farrow, the first communication she'd received from him in months. "Saw your ex-husband in the paper again. Looks like he's doing well for himself." She deleted the message without responding. Nolan had moved to Portland after his own divorce, starting over with a new job and a new identity. He'd cut all ties to his old life, including her, the moment his affair became public. Meanwhile, Reese worked the early shift at a medical device company, entering data and handling customer service calls. It was mind-numbing work for someone with her education, but it was the best job she could find with a suspended medical license and a fraud investigation on her record. Her student loan debt had grown to over $150,000 with penalties and interest. The monthly payments consumed most of her salary, leaving her with barely enough to survive. She lived in a studio apartment, drove a 15-year-old Honda, and bought her clothes at thrift stores. The Medical License Review Board had offered her a path to reinstatement. Complete an additional year of supervised clinical rotations, pass a comprehensive ethics examination, and submit to ongoing monitoring for 5 years. But even if she completed all requirements, the scandal would follow her forever. No prestigious hospital would hire her. No respected practice would accept her. Every morning, both women drove past the billboard that announced their former husband and father's success. Every day, they were reminded of what they'd lost and why they'd lost it. Grant's transformation wasn't just financial, it was personal. The quiet, self-effacing man who had accepted disrespect for decades was gone, replaced by someone who commanded respect through strength and accomplishment. He walked taller, spoke with authority, and never again accepted treatment that diminishes worth. The community college had named its electrical training program after him. The mayor had given him a key to the city. Local businesses sought his partnership and his endorsement. He'd become exactly what Lorna and Reese had always wanted him to be: successful, respected, influential. The difference was that now he was those things on his own terms, for his own reasons, surrounded by people who appreciated his value. In the evening, Grant returned to his new home, a modest house on 10 acres outside town, where he could work in a shop and tend his garden without distraction. It wasn't elaborate or expensive, But it was his, paid for with money he'd earned and decisions he'd made. Tate lived with him still, the old Marine's health declining, but his spirit strong. They spent their evenings on the porch, watching the sunset over the valley and talking about the future. "Any regrets, son?" Tate asked one evening as they shared their ritual coffee. Grant considered the question seriously. He thought about Reese as a little girl, curled up in his lap while he read her bedtime stories. He thought about Lorna in the early years of their marriage, when she'd still kissed him goodbye and asked about his day. "I regret that it came to this," he said finally. "I regret that they couldn't see what they had until it was gone. But I don't regret taking back my dignity." "And you won't take them back? Even if they apologized, even if they changed?" Grant was quiet for a long moment, watching the last light fade from the sky. Some bridges, once burned, can't be rebuilt. Some trust, once broken, can't be repaired. They made their choice, and now they have to live with it. His phone buzzed with a message from Elena Rodriguez at the college. "The fall welding class is full, with a waiting list of 30 students. We need to expand the program again." Grant smiled and typed back, "Let's build another workshop. These kids deserve every opportunity we can give them." As he put his phone away, Grant realized that Reese had been right about one thing. His job was done. The job of sacrificing himself for people who didn't appreciate it, of accepting disrespect from those who should have loved him, of being invisible in his own life. That job was finished forever. His new job, building something meaningful, helping deserving people, commanding the respect he'd always deserved, was just beginning. And unlike his old job, this one came with satisfaction, recognition, and the knowledge that his work mattered. In the distance, the lights of Boise twinkled like stars, and somewhere among them, two women were learning to live with the consequences of their choices. Grant felt no satisfaction in their suffering, but he felt no pity either. Justice had been served, and it was sweeter than revenge could ever be.